So I promised we'd talk about it last time. Let's go ahead and discuss the Centaurs. Now, the Centaurs have taken very much a back seat in the campaign. We have seen almost nothing about them. The fact that the players, none of the three parties, have ever actually decided to journey up north to the Stonehold region, has kind of hampered their growth since the Centaurs have stayed in the Stonehold region for, for the most part. Centaurs are, of course, horse people. They are very large, practically giant size, usually standing on average about 10 feet. And they are very strong. An individual centaur is generally going to be a match for most other races, probably the only exceptions to that being a particularly skilled Sclavi and a Lugian. Lugian would be able to beat the unholy crap out of a centaur usually. So the centaurs have an unusual little pseudo society. No one's entirely certain why it cropped up this way. So the centaurs tend to consider themselves, they're basically a cell-based organization. There are groups of centaurs. They don't actually have proper names because there's no need for them. Usually they identify themselves by their leader. So, this is the Bright Eyes group, if you will. This is the clan group of blah, 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 whatever. That's how the centaurs identify each other. And each of these cells coordinates with other cells. But the overall idea is that all of the centaurs are unified, with very, very, very few exceptions. In fact, I can actually only think of two in the entire setting off the top of my head. The centaurs as a people are united in one task, one cause, one goal, one organization. And thus each individual cell will regularly update and coordinate with the other cells as best as they're able, usually physically actually journeying to predetermined destination points in order to say, hey, what's going on, blah, blah, blah. It is worth noting that the Centaurs were one of the races that always existed in what would eventually become known as the Stonehold region. Very rarely would they journey southeast into the area proper where most people actually were. It is rumored that there were centaurs who used to exist within what is now known as Crater. Those are, of course, just rumors. I mean, anybody who would exist in Crater is just ridiculous, right? Nevertheless, I mention that because the vast majority of the Stoneholder races were basically driven there because they refused to be a part of what was going to be the Five Nations. They felt that the Four Nations Accords were too restrictive and too limiting, and they felt that they were being treated as if they were lesser races, and therefore they decided to go and basically found their own nation with blackjack and hookers. Didn't work out quite that way, though. There is no Stonehold nation. I know I've emphasized this a few points, but there are still characters in character who don't understand the fact that there is no such thing as a Stonehold nation. There's a Stonehold city, but that's it. Excuse me, my throat's killing me today. So, the Centaurs always lived in the area that became Stonehold, though. They were kind of pissed when all the other races came out. All of a sudden, there's these mosswarts, and there's these drudges, and there's these kobolds, and there's these gnolls, and there's these goblins. What the crap? Get the hell out of our land. They didn't like the intrusion, and they have made it one of their missions in life to not only push all the Stoneholders out of Stonehold, which is ironic, but also to basically bring down civilization. Yes, really. Their actual modus operandi is to try and disrupt civilization. They think that the systems of what keep society as a, well, I hate to keep using this word, but it's apt. Civilization are bad, are wrong, and should be removed from reality. They should not exist. You might say they believe in discord. They actually venerate the idea of an anarchic society, an entire group of people. Oh my goodness, really? Okay, we can do that too. Maybe. I need to make a more permanent solution for that. Oh my god, that's terrible. Hang on. Let's try to fix this more long term. Anarchic society. They believe that the will of the individual matters far, far more than the wills of the group, which is ironic given how unified they are in that idea. They also don't believe in things like leaders in the traditional sense of the word. Does that help? A little bit. That helps a little bit. We'll move that there. In other words, there are no centaur leaders. Even a given cell does not have a leader. It's just the cell. They're actually a strange form of an absolute democracy. Pardon me one moment. This is pissing me off. Meh. Whoa! too much. There we go. Really? Really? Just this. Fine. We'll go back to the way it was. Fix that later. There. Moving on. Sorry. I don't like to do edits for these, and especially since I don't have time right now to do so. The Centaurs look at the concept of organization as a flaw. They think that people should be able to coordinate, but they disagree with the idea philosophically that that is organization. They think that if there's a irrigation that needs to be dug, then the people get together and they dig it and then they move on with their lives. There doesn't need to be some kind of mandate. There doesn't need to be some kind of committee to decide where to thing it. There doesn't need to be some kind of contract written up and payment rendered for the people to do it. You just get up and you do it. That is basically describing Centaur society in a nutshell right there. The idea that for them, whatever needs to be done, you just do. There's no need for this coordination. I shouldn't say coordination. There's no need for bogging it down with other stuff. If we need a house, we get together and we build a house. We gather the lumber and we put it together. There's no need to go gather chunks of metal in order to give to someone else, in order to procure items to give to another person. This is all just a mess that they feel is completely unnecessary. In their mind, all society should be basically an agrarian base society. And they believe that, genuinely, truly believe that that is the proper way of things. 3 centuries of everyone else in the world disagreeing with them on that has made them rather bitter. There are reports about how the Centaurs used to be fairly nonviolent. In fact, they used to basically have a "you leave us alone, we'll leave you alone" policy. 3 centuries of having to deal with this garbage has basically led them to becoming zealots. It's gotten to the point where they will actively attack towns, farms, caravans, any form of civilization they can, for literally no other reason than to disrupt civilization. They have reached the point now where they believe that all the evils of the world are caused by this, and it needs to be broken down. This makes for a weird situation because on the one hand, the Centaurs are doing this for the good of everyone else, but on the other hand, they hate those other people for being part of that system. And this sort of, "we're doing it for you because I hate you" sort of a thing leads to a lot of violent aggression amongst the Centaurs. Generally, if you see a Centaur in Primus, they are your enemy. And you need to attack them basically on sight, because they're probably going to attack you on sight. And they're probably not alone. It is very rare to find a Centaur. You're usually going to find a warband or a tribe or an attack group or whatever. You might even encounter an entire cell. Usually, by the way, for a little bit of perspective, a given cell of Centaurs is about 100 strong. That's pretty much their average. So 100 Centaurs, as I mentioned earlier, Centaurs are very strong individually. 100 Centaurs is a force to behold. It's something that you don't want to encounter unless you have basically a small army at your back, or an airship, or something like that. Now, I bring this up, well, let's go ahead and talk about the way they view magic, because they tend to view magic as something sacred. They still practice magic, but they practice an incredibly weak and terrible form of magic, because in this setting, magic can be taught. Any given individual, with the exception of blue magic, violet magic, green magic, and a few other specific things like geomancy, for example, can be taught. If you have the will and the dedication, you can sit down and learn how to become a black mage or a white mage or a yellow mage. You can learn how to cast magic, because it is a system. It follows its own rules. Now, the Centaurs don't really believe in higher learning, so any given magic that the Centaurs cast is basically going to be weaker than any other similar spell that someone else might cast, because they just don't know what they're doing properly. That being said, there are a lot of Centaurs who are natural Geomancers, and Geomancy is much more of a natural magic, actually directly interacting with the elemental ley lines, than a more learned magic. And thus, most of the threat from Centaur Magery comes solely from Geomancy. The fact that they can literally... I don't know if you've seen any of Snarg's spells, but Geomancer spells are quite strong, and on purpose. It is funny because geomancy is actually quite rare in the world as a whole, but there are literally more Centaur geomancers than there are every other race geomancers. Like if you tied all the geomancers in the world, the Centaurs would be well over 50%. In fact, probably more like over 75% of all the geomancers in the world are Centaurs. And yes, that is a plot point. So, but again, there's not much to share about centaurs because the party hasn't really done much with them. So they believe, so they have that natural magic in addition to their physical strength. They are quite a threat, and they are more than capable of bringing down a lot of individuals and groups and caravans. They have been a continuous problem for civilized races for years upon years upon years. There are, even to this day, even in the middle of the war, there are centaur raiding bands who are periodically attacking the front lines of troops where the Illuvians are fighting the Neveri, and basically attacking whoever happens to be stronger at the time to ensure that both sides basically wipe each other out. There's a reason. They are one of the reasons, one of several reasons, why the war has been more bloody than it otherwise should be. It is worth noting, however, that for the most part, the centaurs are kind of screwed right now. But I can't really talk about that extensively. All I will say in lore is the fact that there are reports that the centaurs were wiped out, that the Directorate took their airships up north to the Stonehold region and wiped out the centaurs. Because as much as centaurs are a huge, violent, dangerous threat, both with their natural geomancy and their incredible physical strength, they can't stand up against something like an airship. It would take, like, I don't know, a Tusker to be able to manage that. I mean, give me a break. Can you imagine, like, a flying Tusker? Oh, then we'd be screwed. Airships would be useless against flying Tuskers. There has been one player character centaur. I've allowed player character centaurs because basically my reaction as a GM is always sell me on the character. Explain to me why you are a centaur. And the one and only centaur that was made has actually been turned into an NPC who was part of this whole subplot that never really went anywhere. And it was basically someone who was a freak in terms of culture. It was a centaur who didn't agree with the constant violence and the constant aggression, and by chance had had rather peaceful coexistence with the goblins and with the mosswarts, and thus had kind of learned, basically was effectively raised not by centaurs. Remember that the reason the centaurs are so violent and zealot is because of their upbringing. They are not that way innately. They are not that way naturally. So, for example, if you were to take a centaur child and raise it somewhere else, there would be no natural aggression there. There would be no built-in instinct to kill or be violent or anything like that. They would just be raised with whatever cultural standard they were raised in. So, that's a thought. So I'm not opposed to the idea of centaur races. In fact, I'd rather someone play a centaur than a human. But then I already had that argument when two people wanted to play a human when this campaign began, and I was like, no. And they talked me into it eventually. Because, regardless, I think that's actually all I've got to share about centaurs. I'm not sure what we got next week. But I'm still taking your questions as ever. If you have any questions, thoughts, comments, further clarifications, please feel free to put it in the comments below. And I'll see you guys next time.